Halloween 1992. When I was 12 years old, I was gearing up for an awesome Halloween out with my friends. At that time, it was still relatively safe for kids to go combing neighborhoods in search of candy and treats without a lot of parental supervision. Times have certainly changed now, but after this incident, I'm not sure I'd ever want my kids out alone at night, especially on Halloween. Cider Mill Road was long and scattered with lots of houses. It was an area that was kind of known to be spooky, mainly because there was an old house at the end which had lots of swirling ghost stories. I heard many childhood whispers and legends. It was an apple orchard years ago, and the slaves had been brutally murdered. The original owner had hung himself at the top of the staircase. There were so many stories, but all the town kids were enamored by the house. We would ride bikes by the house in hopes of catching a glimpse into its history. We were all certain it was filled with all sorts of paranormal delights. After trick-or-treating for several hours and almost reaching the end of Cider Mill Road, a friend suggested we go knock on the door of the house and see if anyone answered. We knew an old woman lived there by the last name of Murphy. No one ever saw her out much, but she had inherited the property and had lived there for probably 50 years. It was a big house, especially for one person. I always thought it had to be lonely to be unmarried, no children, and living in such a big old run-down house. My dad called it decayed gentry, although I had no idea what that meant. The driveway winded up through the orchard, which lay sprawling in front of the house. No one tended to the apples anymore, and so most of them lay rotting on the ground, which by October was more of a rotting stench than an apple fragrance. "Hey, you go up and ring the bell," Jessica told me. I shrugged. "I'm not going by myself." "Take Olivia with you," she said. Olivia shook her head. "I don't think so. It's getting late. I need to get home." Jessica grabbed our hands. "We'll all go together." "It smells bad," Olivia said. "I don't want to go up there." I agreed. "Yeah, the apples stink. If an old woman lives here, she might already be in bed. She probably doesn't want trick-or-treaters." "She doesn't even have a front porch light on," Olivia said. "Universal sign for leave me alone." "You guys are such chickens. Come on. It's Halloween. Let's just do this and then we can go to school on Monday and tell everyone what happened. We'll be the coolest kids in class." Much to my dismay, we were being led further up the dark gravel driveway to the dilapidated mansion at the top of the hill. Olivia had some neon glow sticks, which was the only light we were able to see with because it was pitch black, and we didn't have any flashlights. It had been a fairly cloudy night, although it was almost a full moon. We had only had glimpses of moonlight the entire night. None of us thought ahead to bring any other light sources. When we reached the top of the hill where the house was positioned, I got a cold chill. I was shaking. I don't know if it was the temperature outside or the fact that I was frightened, but my teeth were slightly chattering. The three of us approached the house and climbed up onto the porch. Jessica pushed me forward. "Ring the doorbell," she was whispering. I don't want to ring the bell, I said. She pushed me again. Just do it. I stepped forward. My eyes had begun to adjust to the darkness, and I could see the door in front of me with elaborate stand glass. Although my hand was shaking, I reached for the bell. I pressed it. Immediately, Jessica and Olivia start giggling and screaming. They take off running, leaving me standing on the porch. I heard a noise from inside the house. I darted off the porch. I tripped over my witch's dress and fell face first on the grass. My pumpkin-shaped bucket filled with candy spilled onto the ground, but I was too scared to bother with it. I threw the bucket down, trying to see my way to the drive, but it was dark. I could hear the girls giggling in the distance, somewhere ahead of me. Those bees, I mumbled under my breath. My feet hit the gravel on the road. My heart was pounding. Why was I so scared? I was on the road now, and away from the house. I was in a safe place. The old woman was probably in bed. She hadn't even opened the front door. I told myself not to be afraid. I was fine now. We were just being dumb kids. I had slowed from a sprint down. I was breathing heavily, but slowed down to a walk. I could make out headlights down Cider Mill, so I knew I was not far from the road. Those girls would be waiting down there at the end for me. I'd give them a piece of my mind. Shiz, I said in a low voice. Stupid girls. When all of a sudden, out of nowhere, two hands were grabbing at my chest from behind. Something was pulling me. I let out a scream. Something had me. I could hear it snarling and hissing as it pulled me. I tried fighting it off. It was dragging me over to the side of the driveway. I could see the outline of an apple tree in the moonlight. I could smell that rotting stench. I was only 12, but I was fighting as hard as I could. I was screaming and yelling, "Help me!" I tried hitting the arms of me. I was as combative as I possibly could be, feeling like I was fighting for my life. Whoever had me was not letting go. I felt sharp nails digging into my chest while it was pulling me towards the apple tree. Who are you? Let me go! The clouds must have moved away from the moon, because for a moment again the moonlight was shining down, illuminating the orchard again around me. That's when I caught a glimpse. What had its arms around me was an old hag. A woman, but she was old and looked half dead. She had flesh that looked like it was also rotting away from her face. She was still gurgling and snarling. I managed to twist myself loose, and the second I did, I felt her sharp nails on my back. But I took off running. I ran through the orchard, dodging trees. I felt the disintegrating apples squishing and oozing under my feet. At one point, I slipped and fell into a pile of the mush. I finally made my way to the gravel and did not stop until I was at the main road. Of course, my a-hole friends were posted up waiting for me, but the minute they saw me bolting by, they did not laugh. I was in shock. Somehow we managed to get to a neighbor's house where the person called my parents to come pick me up. My friends explained what had happened and how they'd left me at the house. I had scratch marks on both my chest and back from the incident. My parents decided we needed to call the police and make a report. The cops thought it was probably just a Halloween prank, Probably some teenagers trying to scare me. We ended up getting a huge lecture from the cop and our parents. The next day was a Sunday. I was still really terrified about what had happened and was adamant it was not just some teenage kids messing with us. I kept telling my parents over and over that it was something else. My mum finally told me it was enough and over with, and we didn't need to rehash it again. By early evening, I had settled into being a bit calmer about the whole thing when the phone rang. My dad answered, and after a few minutes of, "Yes, I see, and I understand," he came into the den where I was piled up, watching TV. My mum was sitting in her chair, reading a book. She looked up at my dad, who was kind of pale. "What is it, George?" she asked. He looked at us both with astonishment and said, "That was Deputy Richardson from last night. He went over to do a welfare check on Mrs. Murphy after they couldn't reach her last night for questioning. It turns out Mrs. Murphy was dead inside her house the whole time. Apparently, the coroner says he estimates roughly that she probably died back in August. He says they still have no signs of anyone else being at the house last night. The house has not been broken into or anything. The only thing they found outside was your bucket of candy, which was all over the ground, just like you said." "Honey, didn't you say it was an old woman who grabbed you?" Mum asked, horrified. I'm finally ready to talk about what happened last Halloween. Tomorrow, my sister would be 23. It's going to be a rough one for my parents, but I don't think they've given up hope that any second she'll breeze right in the front door to blow out the candles on her cake. She won't, of course. I think my sister might be dead. She was always so stupid. Please understand that I say that with all the love in my heart. Laura was naive and trusting, gullible. The police still think she ran off with one of her many past flings. Any boy could have told her any lie, and she'd swallow his story. Hook, line, and sinker. I tried my best as her older sister to instill her with some kind of backbone, to help her hone her skepticism. I was the older and warier sister, the cynic. The fact that she's still missing is evidence of my failures. It was a Halloween party. The invitation was the most gorgeous thing I had seen in my life. A gold leaf pressed oak leaf with a learning cursive in words of silver. Pinterest would have lost its collective mind over the craftsmanship. Laura never told me where the invitation came from, only that it was the members of the in crowd of a small liberal art college who received them. Exclusive. Of course she wanted to go. It was her last hurrah of youth. The final year before school let out, and she had to face the real world as a real adult. Parties in the graduating year take on a sort of desperation, like a single chick on New Year's frantically searching the crowd for a kiss in the final minute of the countdown. I personally don't miss college, and I don't miss the college parties. But Laura wouldn't go alone. She was adamant. Halloween was always my favorite holiday, and she used that in the week it took to wear me down, talking about costumes and how we were going to show up everyone else. She wanted to be the hottest one there. I wasn't resentful that standing next to my plain self would make her shine all the brighter. I wasn't. She wanted to be the it girl of the in crowd. I loved the challenge of sewing the costumes. Found some incredible patterns for flapper girls from the roaring 20s. Laura didn't catch the irony of me basing hers on Daisy Butchen of The Great Gatsby. It suited her. She was stunning in it, though she could have worn a burlap sack and had the same effect. We spent the day of the party hanging out and catching up. Laura sat on the counter of my tiny studio apartment, sipping raws and cracking jokes while I baked brownies. She brought the bottle for herself. I don't drink at parties. The brownies were a gift for the host. Laura teased me about it because it's not going to be that kind of party, silly. Not some house party where nachos were considered a home-cooked meal, she meant. Not the kind of party I usually got invited to. Technically, I hadn't been invited at all, which of course is why I wanted to bring brownies in the first place. Mum always told us we should never show up empty-handed at a gathering. A bottle of wine would have been more appropriate, I guess, but I couldn't bring myself, actually, face going into a liquor store to buy one. I hadn't drunk in a year. Not since the last party I'd been to. I didn't have a sobriety chip to mark the occasion, just the scars. I don't mind taking the role of the DD. It puts my mind at ease knowing I can offer a safe ride home so no one has to try anything stupid. The autumn drive was golden. The setting rays of the sun lit the woods like each tree was emitting their own light. The air through the ocean car windows was perfume. The sweetness of leaves beginning to decay. I have a pretty clear memory of the light hitting Laura's profile at the perfect angle to make her eyes glow as she grinned and fiddled with the music. Carefree and unburdened in a snapshot of what should have been a perfect day. We took some wrong turns. The invitation directions were precise, but the twists and turns of small rural roads got the best of us a few times. So it wasn't until after sunset that we found the cluster of other cars in an otherwise unassuming patch of bare dirt that let us know we had arrived at the right place. We went the rest of the way on foot, guided by sound of music. I thought the invitation had been a work of art, but it paled in comparison to the spectacle that was the rest of the party. If you guided the greatest minds of the greatest hipsters, wedding blogs, and shut them in a think tank with an unlimited budget for a month, you might get something close. The clearing was dominated at the center by a single tree, the most massive oak I'd ever seen in my life. The boughs were laden with what must have been hundreds of colored glass jars, each lit by a tiny flickering candle. "My camera!" My sister clutched my arm suddenly. "I can't believe I forgot my camera." I was too awestruck to respond. Belatedly, I realized the music that had led us down the path was live. A 5-piece acoustic band played something I imagined to be the background soundtrack of Florence Welch's Brain. Though I'd poured my heart and soul into our costumes, I suddenly felt very inadequate and underdressed. Apparently, it was a theme party. Nearly every other guest was in elaborate stage quality costumes that could have at any second broken into a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. A masquerade of forest animals milled through the clearing. The animal head masks were startling detailed. A hawk glared sideways at me from across a massive bonfire, and the flames danced in the liquid reflection of his resin eye. There was a collective shift as we entered the scene, subtle, but they're all the same, as if we were understudies that had disrupted the flow of a rehearsal. Ah, I thought, theatre majors. A stag-headed man stepped smoothly through the space to greet us. His voice was muffled to the mask, but baritone and pleasant. I wondered if he belonged to the band and was taking a break. "Welcome. We're glad you made it. It's a bit of a labyrinth on those country roads. Please, help yourself to any refreshments you like. We're only just getting started." He gestured to a pair of long, low wooden tables laden with platters of mouth-watering food. I was suddenly eager to hide my own offering behind my back, but our host was gracious about it. A gift, he said? How very old-fashioned of you. Thank you. I believe there's room on the end of the table. I know how it looked, typed out like that, but he didn't make it sound like an insult. Laura was only half paying attention, still taking in the drool-worthy decorations. I knew she was seething at herself for leaving the camera behind. As a photographer, that thing was practically a third eye for her. Our host excused himself, and I was relieved to spot others I recognized from Laura's social group. Now that my eyes had adjusted, they were easy to pick out. It was obvious we weren't the only ones who didn't know this party was going to be themed. The guy in an ironic nurse costume looked acutely self-conscious. Most were gathered around the table with cups in their hands, awkwardly waiting for the alcohol to kick in, dependent on it as a social lubricant. I squinted at the dishes. There was no way those were real silver, right? Laura's friends cooed over her get-up and filled her in on everything they'd observed so far. Heavy smoke from the main bonfire veiled the partygoers. I guess they were using greenwood. The crowd flowed in circles, like a massive slow-motion square dance. Some were handing out party favors to others. Ribbons and flower crowns and things like that. Groups formed and dissolved according to some unknown pattern, shifting like motes of a dust in a beam of sunlight. People came and went, obscured by the smoke as the sky deepened in silky darkness. I was stiff and awkward on the fringes of the crowd. Everyone had a drink in their hand, and it seemed like everyone wanted to put one in mine. I waved off more offers than I could count. A sparrow, a rabbit, a pair of fair-looking foxes. With the many masks, it felt like feeding day at the petting zoo. Only I was the animal in the pen. It was overwhelming, overstimulating. I couldn't focus. I just couldn't focus well enough to carry on a conversation. Each thought I had was as hard to catch as the smoke that stung my eyes and settled heavy in my lungs. It was perfumed with something. I thought until I saw a bear throw a leafy branch onto the flames. The fragrance was only leaves. I don't drink at parties. I had very little to do until the music picked up and I felt something wild sing out in my blood. A ripple of excitement made waves through the party, and wordlessly the people began to dance. I finally saw Laura again. The stag-headed host led her into the middle of it all. What was his name? Had he ever said? Even as I joined the dance, I kept to the edges of it. My feet were clumsy, and I didn't know the steps. Some sort of folk dance with a lot of twirling and getting passed back and forth. Maybe every 1 in 20 people I linked arms with one of Laura's friends. They were having an easier time of it. The gloss of drunkenness in their eyes, their movement freer as their inhibitions loosened. There was something happening to us. The dance was too fast for us to speak, and I couldn't make myself form words, but there was an understanding with every fleeting spin. When we made eye contact, our feet picked up, faster and higher. There was something happening to us. I broke the floor of the dance like a heavy stone thrown in a still pond, pushing and jostling my way out. I needed to be away from the smoke and the touching. Hands on my elbows, on my arms, my shoulders as each dancer tried to pull me back in. A forest of grabbing hands and leading teeth in fixed grins. I couldn't breathe. In the harsh shadows cast by the flicker of flames, the mask warped and changed. The fur looked dense, the feathers more jeweled. What at the beginning of the night appeared rubber now moved like flesh. Animal eyes rolled in their sockets to watch me as I struggled through. I had to find Laura. She was still with the stag, a tiara on her head. It shone with the luster of real gold, though. I could have sworn I'd only seen plastic before. An ornate clay bottle was being passed hand to hand through the dance. The stag's eye met mine as he took a swig. The lips somehow wrapped and warped around the neck of the bottle as if they were his own. He laughed and his tongue was wine-stained. The dance changed. Somehow impossibly faster, wilder. Hands were still on me, but this time to push me away rather than pull me in. I was forced out. Away from the smoke wasn't any better. Foggy, heavy and thick under the branches. The air was cleaner though. It smelled like cool water and the promise of rain. I couldn't get a sense of time. I couldn't separate this party from the last. Couldn't separate myself from the self of a year ago. I wasn't drunk this round, but the confusion and thoughtfulness panic were the same. What happened to me then wasn't happening now. I hadn't had a drop to drink this time around. Something touched my hands and I wheeled back. I hit the dirt hard and scrambled back until I couldn't anymore, hemmed in by brush. I couldn't get my legs to obey me, to lift me off the ground and run. I was as helpless as the first time. It was the hawk. When he spoke, the words were stained, warped, coming out of a throat never meant to mimic human speech. "It's rude," he was saying. "It's rude to refuse a horse generosity the way you have. We've offered you everything you could want, fine drinks and food and music and trinkets, and you take nothing. You're ungrateful, and your insults will not be tolerated." There was something in his hand and it glinted coldly. My stomach dropped. I could think of nothing to do. I could think of nothing at all. I was going to die here without even understanding why. Then he stopped. The stag was there. I hadn't seen him arrive. The whole party was behind him, the music dead. They watched with bloodshot eyes, foam at the corner of their wretched mouths. It is not our guest who is being rude, see. She has brought a gift for us. My brownies, they were still on the table, crappy paper plate, nestled among silver platters and crystal bowls. Somehow they looked even shittier than before. The stag leaned close to the hawk and lowered his voice. "So watch your tongue, lest you lose it. Some of us still abide by the rules of old-fashioned hospitality." He winked at me. His eyelids was creased. He had never looked more real. Certainly he was more real than I was. I was nothing but a creature in a trap. I was nothing but formless fear and confusion piled in human skin. Laura's arm was still linked with his. The fire lit her face like she was emitting her own light. A pretty illusion. She didn't say a word. Her eyes were drunk and far away. I became aware of the music once more. Farther away this time, the dance resumed like nothing had ever disrupted it. The crowd ebbed and flowed, moving in unknowable patterns, but every step took them further away from me. By the time shame got me back on my feet, they were on the far side of the clearing. The oak had been stripped of its light, and I could see them bobbing and weaving with the dancers as they slipped through the trees and into the mist. I couldn't catch up with them. Everywhere I put my feet was wrong. Every step there was something to trip on, or something to snag my costume, forcing me to fall behind even further, while I untangled myself. At some point, I lost them. I stood alone in the bone-chilling fog until violent shivers gripped me from my stupor. Somehow, I found my car again. Somehow, I got it started and drove home without ever having a thought. The next day, I reported my sister as missing. All I could tell them was that we had gone to a party and she had left with a guy I didn't know. I tried somehow showing them the invitation. It was tacky spray, paint and metallic marker on a crumbling leaf. Not at all like I remembered it. In mid-November, I went back to the clearing. In broad daylight, it took me hours of wrong turns to find. It was so much smaller than I recalled. If not for the oak, I would have thought it wasn't the same place at all. The oak was dead and rotting when it stood. There was a table of sorts, a fallen tree with a roughly chunk out of the top to make a lumpy surface, none of the craftsmanship I'd admired. The whole area was littered with garbage, crushed plastic bottles, filthy cans and plastic bags. Here and there were trampled pieces of cheap plastic costume jewellery, the kind you find in the kids' party section of dollar stores. I retraced my steps the best I could. A little beyond where I remembered stopping in ground gave way to a ravine. Not a deep one, not the kind you can lose a party of 200. Just 6 feet deep, just enough to loom over my head as I stood at the end of it, where the exposed roots of a tree above the ravine reached down and formed a rough arch shape with nothing but solid rock behind them. Tomorrow is my sister's birthday. She's not going to waltz back home like she's attending some twisted surprise party. It's too early for that. The door won't be open yet. I'm finally ready to talk about what happened last Halloween, because this one, when the doors opens again, I'll be going through to bring her home. Warning to the people in the Portland, Oregon metro area this Halloween. This really freaked me out. Yesterday, I noticed my neighbor hadn't put out all his Halloween decoration, lights, etc. The past 2 years I've lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well. He's younger, single, but I know he likes kids. Not in a creepy way. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway, and I saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up, or the house up the street is going to beat you for the best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy out. I asked if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now, I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming around our neighborhood, which is a pretty safe neighborhood with tons of young families living here. So I asked him what happened. He said last year he had his brother's family over so they could trick or treat in the neighborhood, since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door like always. His family took off around 10:30, and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters. But by 11:30, they were pretty much done. So he was inside, watching TV, and the doorbell rings. He grabs the candy ball and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight, and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters to still be out. But then notices he hasn't turned off all his decoration lights yet, so his lights are a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell, "Boo!" or something to freak them out, but stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13 to 14 and the other around 16, 17. Both boys. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness, like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him, and he noticed they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there, holding the candy ball, like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character, and ask for candy or something. The younger one said they had gotten lost and needed to come in and use his phone. That was when he closed the door, more than halfway on them, and said, "No, sorry." And the older one said something like, "Can we just wait in your house until our parents come get us?" But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high or something, or intending to rob him. And he just kept mumbling, "No, sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so bloody scared at that point that they were going to try to break in through one of his windows or something. But he looked through the peephole and they had turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all. And he said he stayed up till like 5 a.m. because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my god, this sounds so familiar, just like the Black-Eyed Kids urban legend. Then I thought, hey, maybe this dude is trying to scare me because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him incredulously, but trying not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, this is really crazy. Sounds like the Black-Eyed Kids. He just looks at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? And I said no, but told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later, I get a knock on my door, and admittedly almost jump out my skin, thinking it's a demon child. It was my neighbor, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of the Black-Eyed Children before, and it's so similar to what happened to him. So we talked a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about that urban legend, and it's possible it was just teenagers with black scleral contacts trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius, by the way. But he said the fear he felt was so primal and came over him the second he opened the door for them. Anyway guys, beware. I guess Halloween would definitely be the perfect cover for them. When it snows on Halloween. Halloween is a big deal in my town. Every house goes all out in a competition to see who can freak out the most kids. Luckily for us, they also compete to see who can give out the best candy. It's pretty great. And this year, my friends and I were finally old enough to go trick-or-treating alone. I spent all day getting ready with my friends Ashley and Sherry. I was going as a vampire. Ashley was a witch and Sherry was a werewolf. I was just putting some fake blood around my mouth as a finishing touch when Ashley gasped. "What's wrong?" I asked without taking my eyes away from the mirror. "It's snowing." Shiz. Remember when I said Halloween was a big deal in my town? Yeah, well, snow on Halloween was an even bigger deal in my town. It only happened once in my lifetime, and that was 10 years ago when I was 2. So I don't remember it at all. But that didn't matter. Every year in the days leading up to Halloween, the grown-ups in town would drill it into our heads that snow on Halloween was a bad sign, and that if it snowed, we had to follow the rules. The rules were, if it snows on Halloween, every trick-or-treater wearing a mask will be asked to take it off before they can get candy. If you are wearing a mask, you must take it off before taking any candy. If someone refuses to take off their mask, do not offer them candy and do not speak to them. We didn't know the why behind the rules, but honestly, I didn't care. Sherry was the only one of us wearing a mask after all. Sucks to be you, Sherry, I joked. Hope that giant fur ball of a mask is easy to take off and on. Yeah, Sherry, Michaela and I will leave you behind if you aren't fast enough, Ashley said with a laugh. Very funny, guys. The good news was that we were staying at Ashley's house for the night, and her mum wasn't much of a nagger, so I figured she'd give us a quick reminder of the rules as we went out the door, and that would be it. My mum, on the other hand, was a definite nagger. I could sense her phone call before my cell phone even rang. Yes, Mum, I said, as soon as I answered, not letting her get a word in. Sherry's the only one wearing a mask, and she knows to take it off before getting candy. We won't talk to anyone who doesn't take the mask off. Blah, 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 blah. Love you, and see you tomorrow. I hung up and giggled. Parents, am I right? After one last look at our costumes to make sure they were perfect, we tumbled out the front door and into the snowy neighborhood. Our plan was to start at the house next door and work our way around the neighborhood as the night got darker. The inner streets had some seriously creepy looking houses, and we wanted to hit those when it was good and dark out for maximum creep factor. Do you think Josh and the guys will be out? Ashley asked as we headed up the walkway to the nearest house. She had an obvious crush on Josh, but swore up and down that she didn't. No idea, Ash, I said as I rang the doorbell. Trick or treat! As the night went on, Sherry got pretty quick at ripping her mask off. Her head the second she was asked. I had to give it to her because she put it back on every time. I know the mask completed the werewolf costume, but I probably would have just left it off after the 4th or 5th house. Just before 9 o'clock, we hit the last house in the neighborhood. They were known to give out 2 full-size candy bars at the end of the night just to get rid of them. We ran past a group of kids who were just leaving and bounded up the steps. Trick or treat! What great costumes. Go ahead and take 2 bars if you'd like, the woman at the door said. But you two will have to take off your masks first. 2? I looked over at Sherry and saw another kid standing next to her. She was dressed as a scarecrow with a burlap sack over her head. The mouth was crookedly stitched on and the eye holes were jaggedly cut. I shivered and looked away. Jumped some kid trying to get their last bit of candy like we were before the neighborhood shut off their porch lights and turned in for the night. I reached into the plastic pumpkin the woman was holding out and grabbed a Twix and a Milky Way. I looked over at Sherry, who was pulling off a mask. The scarecrow stood still next to her, her mask still on. Ashley grabbed the 2 bars and nudged Sherry. Come on, Wolfie, let's go. Sherry grabbed the candy and turned to the scarecrow. Hey kid, you gotta take your mask off if you want any candy. Sherry, you can't talk to him, I blurted out. What? She looked confused for a second before her mistake dawned on her. Oh no, the rules. Sherry had moved to town 3 years ago, so the rules weren't as engraved in her as they were in Ashley and I. We looked at the woman at the door nervously, hoping she would tell us the rules were just some silly made-up thing to make Halloween seem more scary. Instead, a look of pure terror crossed her face, and she yanked the plastic pumpkin back to her chest. Run, she whispered, before slamming her door shut and clicking the lock. Ashley and I grabbed Sherry and pulled her down the stairs. We couldn't help but scream, though we didn't know why exactly the woman was so afraid. As we rounded the corner of the sidewalk, I turned to look behind us. I let out a shriek when my eyes met the jagged, empty eye holes of the scarecrow's mask. She was right behind us. "Faster!" I yelled, pulling on my friend's hands as I sprinted down the sidewalk towards Ashley's house. If we could just make it inside, we'd be safe from whatever this thing chasing was. Over the ragged gasps of our breath as we ran, I heard the sound of straw rubbing together as the scarecrow gained on us. Finally, I saw the illuminated front porch of Ashley's house. The three of us sprinted up the front steps faster than we'd ever dreamed of running in gym class. Ashley reached for the doorknob and froze. It was locked. She fumbled for her key as Sherry and I pounded on the door for her mum to open up. I could hear the rustling sound of the scarecrow getting louder. Just when I thought my heart would beat straight out of my chest, Ashley swung the door open and pulled us inside. She slammed the door shut and locked it before turning the porch light off. As we collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, my eyes turned to the side table by the door. On it was a piece of notebook paper. I picked it up and read it quickly before crumbling it up. "Your mum got called in for an emergency shift at the hospital, Ash. We're alone." Before Ashley could respond, there was a loud bang on the front door. The scarecrow was here, and it was mad. "We have to barricade the door," I said, standing up and grabbing the side table. Ashley got up and grabbed the other side of the table so we could move it up against the door, while Sherry dragged over a chair from the living room. Bang! Something hit the window above us as the front door number rattled at the same time. "Is there more than one of them?" Sherry asked. "No idea, but we need to get away from the door now," I said as I scrambled for the staircase. I figured being off the ground floor was safest. We ran into Ashley's room and started pushing her desk up against the door. I was pretty sure the scarecrow outside was no ordinary kid, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if it got to us. "Guys, I'm sorry," Sherry said through choked sobs. "I didn't even think. I just thought it was some dumb kid and I..." "It's okay, Cher," I said. "We're going to be okay." Bang! All three of us shrieked in unison as Ashley's bedroom window shook from the force of being hit. I turned to look and saw those jagged, empty eye holes pressed up against the window. How did it get up here?" Ashley screamed. "I don't know, but we need to hide," I said. "Follow me." I ran to the closet and ushered them inside, closing the door tight behind us. We huddled together behind Ashley's hanging clothes, our backs pressed as far up against the closet wall as we could. The angry banging on Ashley's window continued. I braced myself for the sound of the window shattering from the force of the scarecrow's blows, but instead, another bang sounded from the door to Ashley's bedroom. Next, another from the window, then the door, then the window. Sherry wept beside me. While Ashley rocked back and forth, I prayed to God that I wouldn't skip school again, and I'd do all my chores, and I'd never ever do anything bad again if she'd let us live. The assault on Ashley's window and door went on for hours. I swore I could hear the rustling of straw rubbing together from just outside the closet door. I was certain the door would open at any second, and the thing dressed as a scarecrow would drag us all down to hell with it. But finally, the banging stopped. We waited in silence for minutes, huddled together in fear. Silence. I pulled out my cell phone and checked the time. 12:05 a.m. November the 1st. We made it. I walked home on Halloween. I just found this subreddit, and I thought it would be kind of fun to share a kind of spooky event that happened to me a few years ago around Halloween. I had just moved to my current flat in Rainers Park, southwest London, and was still fairly unfamiliar with the area. Now, my current bosses and supervisors know that I am still fighting a losing battle with the underwhelming reliability of South West trains, and as a result, have less than reliable timekeeping when it comes to arriving to work on time. A battle I'd hope to circumvent with the purchase of a bicycle. Sadly, though, all too often the London weather and my inherent idleness jointly conspire to one again force me to take the trains to and from work. While some people are more than aware that the trains keep me from arriving at work on time, not many of you are aware of the troubles I have returning home. That is to say, I have many a time found myself stuck at Clapham Junction with no train to take me back to Rains Park. In these circumstances, I have to take a bus to Wimbledon Common and walk the remaining 3 miles on foot. It is actually quite a pleasant walk. London doesn't have many hills. If I walk along the ridgeway, you can actually occasionally catch a nice view. True, it is of Croydon, but a nice view nonetheless. Now, to call Wimbledon Village a privileged area would be an understatement. The driveways are home to sports cars and luxury utility vehicles. So you can imagine I have very uneventful walks home. I rarely see anyone on the trip about, from the odd older couple perhaps walking home after a late dinner party, or even a person walking their dog. The neighborhood is quiet, and it gets to bed early. And that night was just like the others initially. I had gotten off the bus at the War Memorial, walked through the village centre, and turned onto the ridgeway. My phone's battery had died somewhere between Wandsworth and Southfield, so I had to do the walk without music, and this always made the walk seem longer. My usual practice was to walk along and look at the houses, try and guess what the people that lived in the houses would be like. Fast car, business types, SUV, and toys still in the front yard, larger family, that kind of thing. I was playing my game and decided to have a cigarette, so I stopped. I was searching for my lighter and looked around when I noticed that I was not the only one on the street. Now, this was unusual, but hardly alarming. What was strange, however, was that the person wasn't the sort I had grown used to seeing. It was a young lady. She appeared to be drunk or tired, perhaps. I light my cigarette and pause for a second. Just a quick second to judge if she would be capable of making it home by herself. Or perhaps, maybe she would need me to see if I could call someone for her. It was at this point I realized that she was crying. I started to walk over to her to make sure she was alright. She stopped walking immediately, frozen. I noticed she was in some sort of Halloween costume, a schoolgirl in fact, and as I got closer, I began to realize that she was in fact around the age of 15 or 16. She was deathly white. Her makeup must have been professionally done, or she has spent an incredibly long time preparing it. I began to decide that perhaps her friends had made fun of her costume and she had run off from whatever party she had been at, drunken and upset. I began to start feeling a bit unnerved when I noticed that she was staring directly at me as I approached. I can assure you that in a city the size of London, we have an unspoken rule of avoiding eye contact with strangers at all costs. It was at this point I assumed she was under the influence of something other than alcohol, and I decided to be a bit more cautious. I stopped about 4 or 5 feet away and spoke to her. "Are you okay? You seem a little upset. Are you in any sort of trouble?" Nothing from her, apart from that stare. "Have you had a little too much to drink? Maybe some smoke?" "Yeah, right. I know hallucinogens when I see them. Still nothing. Do you need a taxi home? Do you remember where you live? At this, the girl began to cry again, but this time she was absolutely wailing. I could feel her raw sense of despair. I actually flinched at the sound. It was positively unbearable. She was dancing on the board of hysterics, perhaps even putting one foot along the line to see what could happen. I was stunned. I wanted to console her and run in equal measures. I wanted to comfort her and chastise at the same time. All I managed was a meek, "Why are you crying?" She must have heard me somehow, because she began to draw herself back from the edge of what can only be described as complete breakdown. She was still heaving and sobbing, but once again she brought her eyes up to mine and said very softly, "Because you are going to die." Now, I have been unfortunate enough to witness death firsthand on more than one occasion. Suffice to say, these events had always left me with a lot to think about, and I in fact had come to terms with my own mortality quite early in life. It struck me that perhaps, like too many of us had, this young lady had someone quite close to her die recently. Perhaps she was going through the same dark realizations that follow being in the company of death, the same thoughts that can keep children up at night, and the pews full at churches. I wanted to let her know that everything would be fine, and that death was simply a part of life. All I managed however, was a slightly incredulous "I know." At this, she seemed slightly taken aback, almost angry. She responded, "You are going to die, and he is going to kill you." Alarms went off in my head. I began to feel more than a little threatened. I decided right there and then that talking to this girl down from whatever bad high she was on was no longer my responsibility. Had not the venerable Hunter S. Thompson himself warned us of the dangers of underestimating the ability of a drug to take control of the person? "Good luck," I said, and with that, turned and began to walk away. After about 5 steps, I quickly looked back to see her still standing there. She put her head down and began to audibly sob again. I quickened my pace and surely had walked along a natural bend in the road, leaving her out of sight. I had been left agitated. I remember putting my headphones back in my ears and trying to listen to music from my phone, only to remember it was out of power still. I was still 2 miles away from home, but at the pace I was walking, I was confident I could cover the ground in less than 20 minutes. No less than 2 minutes later was when I first heard the shouting. It was a man's voice, and laid within it was an excruciating sense of malice and rage. "I am coming for you." I couldn't quite place where the voice had come from, but it seemed as though he was at some distance behind me, on the same road, possibly from where the girl had been. I immediately realized that I was to be the victim of some sort of Halloween prank. I didn't, however, slow down. I imagined that this was the point when I was supposed to get scared and begin to run, and I was determined not to play along. Again the man yelled, yet this time it seemed to come from significantly closer. "I hate you." Now the voice had seemed to have come from somewhere quite close behind me. That is to say, at that volume I would have expected to have seen the man addressing me, but I was still very much alone on the street. I was also walking quite fast, so the person yelling at me must have run quite fast, yet I had not heard any other footsteps. There was obviously more than one prankster, and they had hidden along points on the street. I quickly decided to be rather a poor sport and cut off the main road down Thornton Road at the Swan pub. I hate to admit that their practical joke had gotten the better of me, and I did not want to see what they had in store for me next. I had made it to the front of the second house on the street when that terrible voice shouted at me again. "You are going to die!" This time, the voice seemed to have come from the entrance of the street less than 80 feet away. Perhaps a last chance at scaring me before I disappeared into the darker side streets. Since these streets were darker, I decided that I would lose no pride in starting to jog down the hill. I knew it was all probably fun and games, but the ferocity of the shouting left me worried that I could in fact be dealing with a real maniac. True, it would have been interesting to be a part of the most elaborate mugging I had ever heard of, but that voice just left me with the impression of true hatred. I didn't want to meet the person, or people rather, that could mimic and channel such malignant feelings at will. I had made it to the curve where Thornton Road becomes Thornton Road, when all of a sudden, "I will kill you!" This time the same voice that yelled, seemed to be directly to my right. He must have been hidden behind the fence of some house, or perhaps even hidden within the house. I had obviously walked right into their trap. I broke into a sprint at this point. Pride be damned. I began to run quite fast, and then faster, straight downhill. At this point, I was actually beginning to panic. My mind was playing terrible tricks on me. It seemed as though the voice was all around me, constantly yelling, constantly screaming. Up ahead was the main road. Warple Road to be precise. Well lit, busy. I could hail a cab and be home in minutes. But the voices, their immensity. "I hate you, you coward! Die! Die! Die!" Every second, all around me, the adrenaline must have been heightening my every sense. I admit I was scared, and it seemed as though for some reason that terrible voice was booming off every surface of the street. It felt as though I was simultaneously running away and into that mad rage. The words felt like gusts of a terrible hot wind, pushing its venomous anger at me. I couldn't take it anymore. The voice seemed to make me share that same intense anger. I thought to myself, am I the one shouting? And I felt like a victim. I wanted to kill the people that were playing this mad trick on me. I felt the hatred. "Time to die, coward. I hate you." I decided I had to give up. In one quick moment, I decided I would stop running as fast as I could and have a cigarette and wait for these people to show themselves. Come what may, I needed answers and a smoke. I quickly stopped my run and spun around. The car beeped as it raced past exactly where I would have run to had I not stopped the exact moment. I felt its air pocket ruffle the back of my hair as it sped past. In my blind panic, I had run past the sidewalk of the main road and onto the actual road. I had avoided running blindly into the road and being run down by inches. I looked up the road I had come from. Darkness, silence. Whoever had been up there was now gone. I lit my cigarette and took a few moments to calm down. Smoking had saved my life that day, friends. I went home after that. Nothing more happened to me. But as I was standing there, trying to calm down, working through the panic, I seemed to remember I felt like I felt like I heard a soft whisper. Perhaps just my imagination. I thought I heard a girl's voice softly saying, "Not such a coward after all." Why do people in St. Louis tell jokes on Halloween? I've lived in St. Louis all my life. I live in an old neighborhood. Houses built in the 60s clash with newer, renovated homes. There's odd parts where building styles change dramatically, and across the street there's another neighborhood and a few apartments. Kids drive up to the neighborhood from across highways. Everything goes silent by 1 a.m. and you're not supposed to be loud or walk around. My parents aren't actually from St. Louis. My dad's been moving ever since he was young, and my mom lived in Colombia all her life. They met at the zoo and moved here for better jobs. For our first Halloween, I was a pumpkin. I was a month and a day old. My parents recall that first Halloween with confusion. They wanted us to tell jokes. All across St. Louis, children have to tell jokes for candy. I didn't think people actually said trick or treat for years. You had to tell jokes, right? Right? I remember finding out pretty much no one else told jokes. Me and mother started a restless search for information as to why we tell jokes. Some sources suggested Irish immigrants, others just think it was a practice that spread across the city. I've never told my mother the truth. I must have been 13 when me and my best friend wandered out of our usual range for trick or treating. I was dressed as a skeleton and she was a witch. My neighborhood is massive, and we actually left it. We walked along a busy road to get candy from other cul-de-sacs. We reached a creepy wooden house. This house always looked out of place. A large dog was seemingly always out front, and I remember hearing stories that I had a drug operation going on. A woman answered the door. My best friend was suddenly very shy and tugged on my shirt. It was her way of saying she couldn't talk. We both had social anxiety at that age, but I was the one who tried to ignore it and speak anyway, to try and relieve the pressure speaking in public put on me. I tell my joke, and the woman looks expectantly at my friend, who is beginning to shrink in on herself. I pipe up immediately. What's a girl's favorite dessert? A blueberry pie. And I grin and casually wrap my arm around my friend's waist, ready to get the hell out of there. She has to say it, the woman whispered. I was a dumb 13-year-old, but I could pick up on her fear. I glanced to my friend and nodded. She stammered out a joke and the woman laughs, looking relieved. Thank God, we don't want those things coming back. She closed the door and left me shocked on her doorstep. I turned wide-eyed to my friend. What did she mean by that? I asked. My friend blinked. You didn't know? She asked. My heart races. Didn't know what? I asked. Hushed. She looked surprised. The demons come if we don't laugh, she said simply. I frowned. That sounded like a pile of horse garbage. I kept my doubts to myself. Now I'm older. I have more Halloweens under my belt. You don't see them when you're young, but when you're older and jaded, you start to. The shadows waiting by doors, growing more agitated by the jokeless second. When I was 15, my joke game was strong as shiz. Clever quips and puns rolled off of my friends' tongues, and my own, because real laughter makes them stay calmer longer. I've seen one start twitching and reaching out to throttle a kid. I've seen others stand painfully close to packs of parents, waiting at the end of driveways for their kids. I've seen the things hiss at car headlights. In a book I read, it mentioned telling jokes to ward off the devil. I'm not sure if it's some kind of groupthink bullshit, but I'm starting to worry there's something wrong here. The odd thing is, people not born here can't see them. There's something odd about the city, and I'm not sure what. And I still can't help but wonder about one thing. Why didn't my friend want to tell her joke? She knew it could have put me or the woman or herself in danger, so why did she hesitate? Even with social anxiety, it reaches a point where you sometimes have to do things. Panic attack be damned. That seems like one of those moments I'll never truly know. I guess. She moved later that year. A cold Halloween night. I got the first hint of what my brother was when I was 5 years old. He was outside playing near the edge of the woods on our family's property, and I was sitting on the back porch playing with my dolls. Our mother was just inside in the kitchen, so she could keep an eye on us. both from the windows. I was well and truly absorbed in my imagination when I heard his voice whisper my name, Alison. I looked up from my toys to see him waving me over to where he was standing. He had a huge smile on his face and seemed really excited about something. I, being 5, also became excited by proxy. I scooped up my favorite doll in my arms and hurried down the stairs to see what was making him so happy. As I approached, he blocked my view of whatever was just behind him and started to giggle. My brother was 12 at the time, quite a bit older than me, so when I got close to him, sometimes he would seem larger than life, like one of the big people. Do you want to see what I found? He asked with a clear tone of exuberance. I nodded like my head was on a spring, eager to see what he had found. He stepped aside, and what had made him so happy finally came into view. It was a rabbit who had crawled in from the edge of the woods. Its back leg had been mangled somehow, likely by either a dog or some kind of trap. I remember the sense of excitement I'd felt fading as I realized the poor bunny had been injured. It looked up at me with sad eyes, and I walked over to get it gently. It's hurt, I said as I turned to my brother with a frown, hoping he was going to try and help it. He just stared down at it with a smile, his eyes still looking extremely excited. I know, he said, practically laughing the words out. Watch this. He walked over and placed the sole of his shoe over the top of the rabbit's head. I can still remember the animal's rapid breathing as he did so, its body quickly rising and falling beneath my hand. I stared at him in confusion, wondering why he would do that, as he very slowly started to press his foot down. The rabbit started making these awful squeals. The closest sound I can compare it to would be like that of a human baby crying. I tried my best to push his foot off, but he just kept pressing down harder. No, Adam, no, I shouted, finally dropping my doll and hitting his leg. He simply laughed as it squealed louder, obviously in extreme pain now. Its working legs kicked at the leaves, and its breathing became erratic. The look on my brother's face made me feel uncomfortable. Even at that age, not understanding what it was, why he would do that. Everything from the wildness of his eyes to the bit of drool coming from the corner of his mouth was terrifying. Tears were falling down my cheeks, and I begged him to stop, but he just continued to put more weight on his foot. I finally heard a crunch sound, and the squealing stopped. The rabbit twitched a few more times, and then fell limp in the dirt. My brother looked at me and seemed to drink in the sadness and terror on my face like it was what he wanted out of this more than anything else. I kept petting the rabbit as my brother suddenly scoffed at my sadness. I went trotting back towards the house. There, kneeling in the dirt next to a dead rabbit, at 5 years old, I started to see what my brother was. It wasn't till a cold Halloween night, 5 years later, that I would know for sure. A week before Halloween, my mother had helped me make a little Red Riding Hood costume, and I was excited to head into town and trick or treat with my friends from school. I can remember wearing my cape and hood around the house nearly every day leading up to Halloween. You can imagine that when my father told me that his boss had invited him and my mother to go to a Halloween party at his house, and they couldn't take me into town, I was devastated. My father was angling for a big promotion and needed as much face time with his boss as possible. He tried to explain to me how important it was, but all I heard was that I was going to miss trick or treating. I was about to break into tears when suddenly my brother came down the stairs. "I'll take her," he said with a smile. My brother and I barely spoke at that age. He was an extremely withdrawn teenager and quite a bit older than me, so when he volunteered to take me, I was shocked to say the least. "Really?" my father asked, likely even more shocked than me. It was nearly impossible to get Adam to do anything. He walked over to us and hunched down to look me in the eye. He was nearly 6 feet tall, still one of the big people. Sure, he spoke to our father, but kept looking at me. "How about I even dress up as a big bad wolf to your little Red Riding Hood?" All I could really do was nod in response. This level of friendliness was nothing like the stoic and strange brother I had grown to expect. My father was pleasantly surprised and thanked Adam for his help. He even called him a good big brother before he went to tell my mother. Adam stayed standing in front of me for a bit longer after our dad walked away. His still smile reminded me a bit of when he called me over to look at the rabbit, a memory I had nearly forgotten until that moment. "Thanks, Adam," I said, suddenly a little intimidated by him. "No problem, little sister." He turned to walk away and headed back up the stairs towards his room. He looked back one final time before disappearing into the top floor. "We're gonna have fun." Adam did exactly as he said he would. I can remember him coming out of his room in his wolf mask, wearing the kind of rubber werewolf gloves you could get from any Halloween store. Other than that, he was just wearing his normal clothes. But honestly, it was more effort than anyone expected from him. My parents laughed and took pictures of us standing next to each other. I honestly think they were just happy to see Adam actually do something with the family rather than spend all his time alone brooding. My mother handed over her car keys to Adam and told us to be safe and have fun. They would apparently be back late, so my mother also told Adam to make sure I was in bed at a reasonable hour. With that, we left for town, just me and my brother. On the way into town, I saw something that struck me as if it was some kind of omen. A kid wearing devil mask was just walking along the road all by himself. He seemed even younger than me, and it was miles into town. I tried to point him out to Adam, but when he went to look, the kid seemed to have vanished. Adam said it was probably just some kid that lived in one scattered houses outside town. I let it go, eager to get into town and start my night. The trick-or-treating went exactly as planned. I met up with my friends and we walked around to the different houses and through the downtown area that was all set up for Halloween. Adam was quiet most of the night, but not unpleasant to be around. He stayed near me the whole night and seemed to be watching over me. He was acting like he was my big brother for once, and honestly, I kind of liked it. When it started to get late, he told me he had to head back. I said goodbye to my friends and hoisted my bag of candy over my shoulder, excited to get home and check out my haul. I was happy. I enjoyed my night in town, and I was actually grateful to Adam for bringing me. "Thank you for bringing me, big brother." I hugged him from the passenger seat of the car before we drove off. "I had a lot of fun tonight." "Good, I'm glad." Adam just smiled at me with his unsettling, still smile, and then headed down the road that led to our house. A few miles from our house, my brother turned off onto a dirt road that led into a surrounding woods. I had been absorbed in hunting through my bag of candy and likely wouldn't have noticed it all if the road hadn't suddenly gotten really bumpy. I turned to look at Adam, and his face was wearing the same stoic expression he normally wore. Where are you going? I asked, looking out the window into the dark woods now surrounding us. Adam kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road, his face remaining still. I can remember looking at his hands and seeing his fingers twitching on the steering wheel as he slowed the car down and pulled over. I thought he might turn to answer me, but instead he reached into the back seat and grabbed a small bag from under the back seat. He opened it up and pulled out a pair of black gloves. I tried again to ask him what he was doing, why we were out there, but he silently put the gloves on. He seemed lost in his own head, and I could feel that something was terribly wrong. Adam, why aren't you saying anything to me? I shouted, my heart thumping in my chest. Adam finally turned to me and smiled warmly. He reached out with one gloved hand and touched my cheek. I flinched at first, but he kept reaching forward. His eyes met mine in the shadows of the car. They looked black. Get out of the car. His voice was dark and rough. It held a tinge of anger that made my blood run cold. I didn't move fast enough, so he unbuckled my seatbelt himself and reached across me to open the door. I don't want to get out of the car, I shouted. What's going on? What are you doing? He snatched the wolf mask he'd been wearing that night off the back seat and got out of the car. I watched in the shine of the headlights as he walked around the front of the car and towards me. His black gloved hand reached into the car and grabbed me by my pigtails. I said, get out of the bloody car, he shouted as he yanked me from my seat. I cried out in pain as he pulled me into the dirt. My sack full of candy I was holding caught on the door handle, and I watched it spill out all over the ground in front of me as I lay there crying. You hurt me, Adam, I yelled at him with tears streaming down my face. Why are you doing this? He hunched down to look at me, much like he had been when he told me he was going to be taking me trick-or-treating. His face wore a cold, humorous smile. We are going to play a fun little Halloween game. He set the small bag he had pulled the gloves from down in front of him and slid the wolf mask back on. The big bad wolf is going to hunt Little Red Riding Hood. What? Is all I could say, totally confused as to what the hell he meant. Things became clearer when he reached into the small bag and pulled out my father's old K-bar knife. I'm going to hunt you, Allison, and if I catch you 2 times, I'm going to gut you. I couldn't believe what he was saying. He was weird and quiet, but he was my brother. Stop trying to scare me, I shouted at him. I started to pick up my fallen candy in some kind of attempt to deny the situation that was right in front of me. I had to believe this was just a cruel prank. This isn't funny, Adam. His hand reached out and grabbed me by the back of the neck, wrenching me close to him. I could smell the rubber of his wolf mask as he held the knife up to my cheek and pressed it into my skin. Do I look like I'm joking, little sister? With those words, he slowly dragged the knife over my cheek and I screamed in pain. He threw me backwards and then started stomping on my spoiled candy like some kind of spoiled child. I clutched my face and felt the blood leak out between my fingers as I sobbed. There is no moment in my life that I felt more terror. He turned back towards me and leaned in quickly with a cartoony growl. Run! He screamed. So I did. I got up, still holding my bleeding face, and ran into the woods. It was darker in the woods than I could have imagined, and my eyes were filled with tears, making it even more difficult to see what was in front of me. Still, I ran so hard my legs ached, and I could feel the sweat on my skin chilling me in the cold night air. Behind me, Adam had started to give chase. After a quick 30 count and a howl at the moon, He was faster than me, and his legs were much longer, meaning he would very quickly catch up to me. I was at a total loss of what to do. I hoped maybe I could make my way back to my house. But even then, my parents were at home. And even if I could call 911, it would take them a long time to get there. I saw a small thicket of bushes and made a quick decision to hide inside. I dropped to my knees and started to crawl through the branches. I could feel them catching my clothes and digging into my skin. I was in so much pain and such sheer terror that I couldn't stop crying. I muttered out loud to myself, asking why he would do this, why he wanted to kill me. I was less than halfway into the thicket when I felt a hand wrap tightly around my ankle and yanked me backwards. Oh, Alison, you are going to have to try harder than that. Adam was standing over me. His foot pressed into my back, adding weight to each sob made by my lungs. He leaned down to look at me in the low light, his face still hiding behind that wolf mask. That's one. If I catch you again, it's all over. He drug his finger over his throat and took his foot off my back, laughing as he did. I was frozen in fear. I know he wanted me to run again, but I couldn't even stand up. All I could do is lay there and cry. The cut on my cheek had started to go numb, either from the cold or from shock, but I could feel each new scratch on my arms and legs. I started praying to myself, the Lord's Prayer I had learnt in Sunday school. Oh, please, would you knock that off? I felt his hand reach down and grab my collar in an attempt to pull me to my feet. I didn't budge. I simply lay there crying and praying. Adam started to get frustrated, and I suddenly felt a foot come slamming into my ribs. Get the bloody up! He kicked me a few more times, but still I refused to get to my feet. I would love to say I was being defiant, but in all honesty, I was just so scared I couldn't move. I heard him pacing back and forth and mumbling to himself. I was messing with his plans and he didn't like that. Not one bit. He suddenly dropped down onto his knees next to me and pulled off the wolf mask. His face held one of the cruelest scowls I'd ever seen, and still to this day, I've never seen another person make a face anything like it. I took off the mask because I want you to see my eyes when I say this, he hissed, his warm breath hitting my face and making me realize just how cold the night air was. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get up and start running again. If you don't, I will cut your Achilles tendons so you can't walk and you leave here. Then I will go back home, kill mom and dad and bring you back there, severed heads, to look at as I slowly cut your bloody heart out. He was telling the truth. I didn't even need to look in his eyes to know that. I could easily hear it in his voice. Do you understand? He asked. Yes, I responded faintly, the weight of everything still sinking in. Good. He stood up and put his mask back on. Now get on your bloody feet and run. He counted slower this time, as I did my best to weave through the trees in the dark. Each number deliberately stated in my direction, letting me know how much of a head start I had left. His voice was getting further and further away though, and I hoped I could get far enough away that he would have some trouble finding me. Give me time to think. My chest hurt from crying and breathing hard. My legs hurt from running, and I wanted to go home. I wanted my parents to come save me, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. I fell deep into thought about how my parents never saw this in my brother. Worse than that, I thought about how I could just have left the cruelty I'd seen from him before slip my mind. He hid behind a seemingly reclusive nature, appearing as just another moody teenager, but I'd seen the real him before with the rabbit. The drool on his lips and the mania in his eyes. I knew it was behind the wolf mask as the count stopped. To him, I was just as helpless as that bunny, and he was having fun toying with me. My mind snapped back to the moment at hand, just in time to stop me from plunging headlong down a 10-foot drop. It was a sharp cut-off ravine in the middle of a group of trees, and in the dark I was lucky to notice it when I did. I had to balance myself to keep myself from tumbling over the edge, as my momentum wanted desperately to carry me forward. "Alison!" I heard Adam shout as he started to close in. I looked to either side of me, but the ravine seemed to stretch on forever on either side. I would need to climb down to keep going forward. In my dress and cloak, it would be nearly impossible to do it quickly, and I could already hear Adam's footsteps getting closer. He was running after me at full speed, and if he caught me in the bottom of the ravine, it was over. I had to try something else. I searched around where I was for some kind of low-hanging branch. There were several trees scattered along the edge of the ravine where I was, and I found one that was almost perfect. It was just a little bit taller than me, and it even had some small bushes around it. I quickly untied my cloak and hung the hood over the branch. The bushes around the base filled out the bottom a bit, making it almost look like a person from behind, at least if you looked at it quickly. I hoped that Adam's wolf mask would obstruct his vision just enough that he would think it was me. I ran a few feet away and hid behind a tree, trying to remain as still as possible. Without my cloak on, it was absolutely freezing in these woods. I felt the goose flesh rise on my skin and struggled to stop my teeth from chattering. I held back my tiny sobs as I heard Adam come barreling through the trees like a maniac, howling at the moon. "Alison!" he screamed again. "I see you, you stupid little bee. You better keep running." I peeked out from behind the tree and saw him making a beeline for the cloak. I found myself praying that he wouldn't see. "Just don't see it. Just fall." Each stride he made towards the ravine made my heart thunder in my chest. I heard the footfalls come to a sudden stop and peered out from behind the tree once again. I saw him standing there at the edge with my cloak in his hand, and had to cover my own mouth to hide the sound of my crying. "Do you think I'm stupid, Alison?" I could see him looking around for me in the dark. "Do you think I was going to fall for that?" He was standing there just laughing. I prayed he would just slip in that moment. He would just tumble back in the ravine and break his neck. My tears stopped and I felt a heat of anger rush into my face. I felt fresh blood leak out of my cheek as I grit my teeth. "Just for that, you know what I'm going to do?" he called out, well aware that I was still nearby. "I'm going to kill Mum and Dad anyway. Hell, I was always going to do that. This is my last Halloween, little sister. Tonight, I'm going out big. I might go back into town and take out some of your friends too. Maybe I'll just hurt you really bad and save you for last. Leave you out in the woods to bleed." My hand found a fallen tree branch in the ground, and I gripped it tightly. "Same plan as before. I'll bring you all their bloody heads so you can look into their eyes as I cut you into ribbons, little sister. You had your Halloween fun. Now get out here and let me have mine." I didn't even realize what I was doing at first, and I think it shocked Adam even more. I came from behind the tree, screaming with the branch held out in front of me like a spear. I ran towards him at full speed before he could decide if he was amused or scared. I think he may have been in the middle of starting another rant when he finally saw what was happening. I put all my weight behind it as I thrust forward into his chest with that branch and watched as he lost his footing. I kept pushing until I knew he was going to fall. I heard him try and say one last thing before he vanished down the drop-off. I fell to my knees, sobbing in a mix of anger and fear as I heard him tumble down the drop-off. I listened as his body landed with a pronounced thud on the ground below. It was quickly followed by a horrid screech of pain. I caught the edge and looked over. At the bottom, I saw Adam, laying with one of his legs twisted the wrong way, and the knife he had used to cut my cheek sticking firmly out of his chest. He pulled the mask off of his face and stared up at me with a desperate, horrified eyes. He would occasionally reach up to try and touch the handle of the blade, but every time he did, he would force out another scream that would end up a gurgling, blood-filled cough. I slowly climbed down the side of the ravine in the safest spot I could, the whole time listening to Adam cry and attempt to scream. When I reached his side, I looked down on him with tears in my eyes and my heart full of pity. He reminded me of the rabbit. The fear in his eyes was exactly the same. His rapid, blood-choked breaths, signaling that his life was almost over. He reached out to me, and for the first time since we'd arrived in the woods that night, he looked like my brother. My eyes were filled with tears, and I didn't know if I was sad for him or hated his guts. But really, it was both. I kneeled next to him, just staring at him and crying as his gloved hand reached out to me. I couldn't look at him anymore, but something also wouldn't let me leave him to die alone. I closed my eyes and listened for a few more minutes as his labored breath slowed and eventually stopped. On my knees, in the dirt, next to his lifeless body, I was once again reminded of the rabbit. I covered his body with my cloak and walked back towards the car. Luckily, the beams of his headlights were still on and made for a good beacon back to the road. Both doors still stood wide open, and the candy I had collected trick-or-treating still lay scattered all over the ground. I climbed inside and shut both doors. I lay down across the front seat and cried for I don't know how long. Eventually, one of our distant neighbors found me and brought me home to my insanely worried parents. They had already been on the phone with the police by the time I got home. I can remember them asking where Adam was, what happened, how I got the cut on my face. I tried to explain but couldn't stop shaking and crying. I just wanted to go back to earlier that night, trick-or-treating with my friends, my big brother watching over me. I wanted it all to be a dream. When the police found Adam's body, they pieced it together though, and I ended up having to fill in what blanks were there. I had to accept it was real, and so did my parents. Nothing was ever the same after that. My family fell apart, and my world fell apart. Sometimes at night, I close my eyes and I can see Adam's face begging for my help. I don't feel pity anymore for him. I remember the rabbit. I touch the scar on my face, and I try to forget him. For 20 years now, I've tried to forget that cold Halloween night.
Well,